Hello, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, we speak with the man behind the latest Jesus headlines, author Reza Aslan. He takes your questions on the controversy surrounding his book, Zealot. What do we really know about Jesus, the man? He's often depicted as a saint-like Messiah who turned the other cheek in the face of anger and hostility. But in his latest book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, author Reza Aslan digs deep into history to paint a picture of a man unfamiliar to society. And the book has created controversy in part due to the fact that Aslan is a Muslim and he's questioning many of the biblical teachings of Jesus. And some of it has to do with this viral Fox News interview.
You're a Muslim, so why did you write a book about the founder of Christianity?
Well, to be clear, I am a scholar of religions with 4 degrees, including one in the New Testament.
Still begs the question, why would you be interested in the founder of Christianity?
Because it's my job as an academic. I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament.
I believe that you've been on several programs and never disclosed that you were a Muslim, and I think that's an interesting full disclosure.
The second page of my book says I'm a Muslim.
Hello, scholar of religions with 4 degrees. It's so great to have somebody that smart on the program. Reza Aslan,
and Muslim.
Welcome. And Muslim
as
well. Welcome from Los Angeles. It's so great to have you in the stream. Our audience will be hearing so much more from you in just a moment, so just sit tight there. We'll be back with you in a second. We also have Malika Bilal, who's our digital producer, with us here today.
Thanks, Femi.
I love those moments where we actually get to see our online community, right?
Right. So we always see them tweeting, the ones on the wall behind you, the ones on my screen here tweeting in, but today we also have them joining in our Google Plus Hangout. So today we have Ashley Miller, who's a writer and member of the Atheist Movement. Amr Hussein is a Muslim interfaith activist and blogger for Huffington Post Religion. Danielle Tuminio is an Episcopal priest. And Maggie Siddiqui converted from Christianity to Islam and is currently a student of Islam and interfaith relations. So welcome to the stream, everyone. Now, for those of you who aren't in the Hangout, remember you can still join in on the conversation. Just use the hashtag AJStream.
We have so much to talk about, Malika, so let's just get started. So, Reza, you're viral. How does that feel like to go viral?
It's kind of weird, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, I'm just excited about these conversations that are taking place. At this point, I'm just this innocent bystander watching these very heady topics like journalistic integrity and the role of religion and faith and scholarship. You know, these are the kinds of things that me and my colleagues sit around talking about in our dusty libraries all the time. It's kind of fun to watch everybody else talk about it for once.
See, I'm looking at the Amazon bestseller list. #1, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Let me just click onto another tab here, see what the New York Times bestseller list is doing. #1 New York Times bestseller for hardcover nonfiction. Reza, how much have your publishers brought you? Have you got flowers, roses, bouquets? You know, I'm thinking that this has got to do with how viral that Fox interview went. I can't see how mainly a scholarly book about Jesus is this popular.
Well, in all fairness, it debuted at #4 on the New York Times bestseller list before the Fox interview, and it was all the way at #2 on Amazon before the Fox interview. So it turns out people are kind of interested in Jesus. Who knew? But the Fox interview certainly allowed it to be seen by a different audience, an audience that perhaps wouldn't normally read a book like this, but was, you know, had their interest piqued because of that interview. No question about that.
See, we've all read the book on the team, and one of the things I found fascinating about it was that I'm thinking of it sort of like a franchise of Jesus, where you've got the traditional telling, and then you've rebooted him completely. Was that the idea?
Well, look, I mean, Jesus has meant so many things to so many people for so many years. I mean, this is a man whose life and whose mission and teachings has been recast to fit whatever situation, whatever community, whatever society that accepts him and believes in him. What was very difficult, I think, for me to do, and it's difficult for scholars who have been doing this kind of work for 200 years, is to kind of get past all of that, to try to move beyond the Christological interpretations about who this person was and get to the man himself. As I say, it's not an easy task, and many scholars have attempted doing it. And really what I've done is kind of distill this very long 200-year-old conversation, this debate about Jesus in scholarly circles, into something that's accessible and readable for a general audience. I know that people who are outside of this kind of world are shocked by some of the statements that I make in the book, but frankly, biblical scholars would not think that what I've written is all that controversial.
Right. And Reza, there's someone on Twitter who wasn't quite shocked about what you said in the book. Some says he, meaning you, Reza Aslan, respectfully explains that he's writing about the historical figure as opposed to a religious icon. So it's the idea of Jesus as a historical figure that I want to take to our next guest in our Google Plus Hangout. Ashley Miller, go ahead.
Hi. Well, I feel a lot of kinship with your historical Jesus because I'm a new atheist and you've accused us both of being zealots in the past. So I find that pretty fun. But my question for you is, what do you find to be the most convincing historical piece of evidence that there actually was a historic Jesus and it's not just a myth?
Yeah, this question I get a lot. It's really a settled question. I don't know why it just keeps coming up over and over again. There was no question that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Who cares? It's not a big deal that this person exists. What's a big deal is what he actually said and did. Specifically to your question, we have evidence from a Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus who wrote the Antiquities in the year 94 CE, who's talking about much more important people who matter as far as Josephus is concerned. The high priest Ananus, the Roman governor Festus, and Albinus. And in the midst of this story, in a very throwaway line, he's talking about this man named James, and he says, James, the brother of Jesus, the one they called Messiah, and he moves on, and that's it. Now, outside of the New Testament, that's it. That's the only evidence that we have that this man existed. But considering that this man was a marginal Jewish peasant from Galilee that nobody cared about except his followers, the fact that someone in 94 CE mentions him in such a way as to assume that his audience is familiar with him is pretty definitive proof that he existed. So this question, I mean, listen, there's a lot of reason for atheists to reject Jesus, but this isn't one of them. Let's just be clear. There was a man named Jesus of Nazareth, but what he said or did, that's totally up for debate.
So I want to get back to this idea of you upsetting people. Even if you're a Muslim and Jesus is a prophet for you, or if you're a very devout Christian and you see the New Testament as being more of a literal text, there are going to be things in Zealot that are going to be deeply, deeply disturbing. Do you want to unveil some of them for us, Reza?
Well, I mean, they may be upsetting to people, you're right, whose conception of Jesus comes from just a reading from the scriptures, whether the Quran or the New Testament, because neither of those texts are historical documents. These are both scriptures. They're sacred histories. They're meant to be affirmations of faith that are composed by communities of faith many years after the events that they describe. The Gospels are incredibly valuable as a document that allows us to kind of figure out what the early Christian community thought about Jesus and who he was, but they don't really help us that much in trying to figure out who Jesus himself actually was. And so a whole host of methodologies have arisen over the last 2 centuries for scholars to kind of get at what is more or less historical in the Gospels by actually taking those claims and analyzing them according to what we know about the time and place in which Jesus lived. And, that's just all that Zealot is trying to do. And so some of the more controversial claims that he wasn't born in Bethlehem, that, the trial before Pilate is just a legendary invention. These are things that would not even elicit, a raised eyebrow in biblical studies. But for the popular audience, I think they come across as quite revolutionary and controversial.
Malika.
Well, as part of those controversial topics, we got several tweets, Reza, from Muslims in our audience. Layla Anwar is on my screen here saying that you said that Jesus was crucified. You said there was no virgin birth. We also got a Facebook comment from Sheikh Mohammed Arslan, which is on my screen now. You say you're a Muslim, but I see that you categorically deny the Islamic belief. He says that Jesus was not crucified. So I want to go to Amr Hussein in our Google Plus Hangout, another Muslim who's joining us. Amr, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here, Reza. My question is, as you know, the Muslim belief is that Jesus was not crucified and raised into heaven, and someone who looked like Jesus was crucified in his place. So in your research, did you find anything that supports this other perspective that's in the Quran?
Well, I mean, one thing that we can be fairly certain about when it comes to Jesus is that he was crucified. I mean, all of his friends, his enemies, his detractors, the people who wrote against him, the people who worshipped him, and even Tacitus and Pliny the Elder, the two historians in the 2nd century who write about Jesus, do mention his crucifixion. I think it's something that you can more or less be fairly certain of. Why does the Quran say that Jesus wasn't crucified? Well, actually, that's an old idea. It goes all the way back to Gnostic Christian teachings. The Gnostics, it's a very complicated religious tradition, but the Gnostics did not believe that Jesus was crucified. They believed that someone in his stead was crucified. After Rome became an Orthodox Christian empire, anyone who disagreed with the imperial religion was put to death. And so the Gnostics fled the empire, mostly went to the Middle East, North Africa, and in the Arabian Peninsula. The Christians that the Prophet Muhammad would have encountered would have mostly been Gnostics who believed that notion. And that's very likely where it kind of came into Islam.
You know what?
So again, that's the historical explanation for it. But listen, the faith explanation is just as valid. If you believe that the Quran is the literal word of God, and that God says that Jesus wasn't crucified, and so therefore you don't believe that Jesus was crucified, that's fine. That's a faith statement. I have no problem with your faith statement. If you are asking me about a historical event, however, then that's what I'm telling you.
But that's really freaking people out though, Reza, because you put such a very interesting case for the crucifixion not to have happened, how it is relayed in the New Testament and how many people around the world believe it happened. And it unpicks a lot of the theology that a lot of people think happened. And then, but you're saying, it's okay, you can still go on believing that, but it's really hard to do that, right?
Well, you said it perfectly. It's the theology that interprets it in a particular way. I'm not a theologian. I don't write about theology. I write about religions and prophets and the origins of religions. And those are historic events. Those are events that we can put our finger on and try as best as we can, since we are dealing with ancient history, to create a historical narrative out of it. This is not a book about, the interpretations of Jesus. It's a book about the man Jesus. Those interpretations by definition are valid. Any interpretation by definition is valid. Now, some interpretations are more reasonable, more historically grounded, but I don't have a problem with anybody's interpretation of Jesus, or for the Prophet Muhammad for that instance. My book, No God But God, overturned a lot of traditional views about the Prophet as well. Because again, it was a book about history, not a book about theology.
See, people listening to this conversation are going to be thinking, wow, this is a really heavy, turgid book. It's actually a fantastic read. It reads like a novel. You start with a murder at the end. We all know how it ends at the end. But you're a very engaging writer. And one of the things that I really enjoyed was the scene setting, the historical scene setting. For instance, I never really thought about how many messiahs there might have been wandering around Palestine at the time. Do you want to pick up on that and share that information with the rest of our audience?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I mean, I try very hard to, write as a writer would and not as a scholar would. And I really want to make my works accessible to a larger and popular audience. And I think that's why people read what I write. But in the case of the world of Jesus, first century Palestine, you don't have to work too hard to make this, as exciting a time as it was. This was an era that was awash in apocalyptic expectation. You had dozens of preachers and prophets and charismatic wonder workers and messiahs walking around, gathering disciples, curing the sick, casting out demons, talking about the kingdom of God, promising liberation from Roman occupation. And by the way, the vast majority of these guys were also killed by Rome, like Jesus was. My attempt in this book is to place Jesus very much within the world in which he lived and allow that world to define him. I think that's where some people have had a problem, because the Jesus that we see in the Gospels is extraordinary, is abnormal, in the sense that he is not like the other Jews of his time in any way, because he's the Messiah, he's God incarnate, however the Gospels see him. But if you want to talk about the Jesus of history, you have to do away with that idea. Jesus was a remarkable individual, there's no question about that. But he was a product of his society. He was like everyone else in his world. And if you want to know what he meant, what he said, what his actions actually signify, you have to place them in the context of the world in which he lived.
Well, speaking of that context in which he lived, we have a tweet here, and several like it. This one's from Oda, who says, "Are you portraying Jesus as a violent preacher?" Now, I read the book, as everyone on our show here today did. It's like one giant book club. So we know the answer to that, but could you answer it for our Twitter audience that perhaps don't?
Yeah, actually, a lot of criticisms of the book have started out by saying that, Reza presents Jesus as a violent revolutionary. No, I don't. I actually state very clearly in the book that there is no evidence that Jesus espoused or openly espoused violence. That said, he was not some simple pacifist. He was not just this inveterate, turn the other cheek pacifist with no concern over the cares of this world. Let's be honest, that person would have gone totally unnoticed by the Roman government. But if Rome thinks that you are such a threat to the political stability of the state that they arrest you, torture you, and execute you as a state criminal, then you were probably a bit of a rabble-rouser. Now, I should say that Jesus' view towards violence was far more complex than I think a lot of people think it was. This was a man who, after all, the Gospels say, told his disciples to arm themselves when they went to go hide out in the Garden of Gethsemane in anticipation of the Romans coming to arrest him. But nevertheless, there is very little evidence that he openly espoused violence against the state himself.
So
Reza, I'm wondering if I could jump in with a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Along those same lines, one of the ideas that came up to me when I was reading was about nonviolent resistance, and I had read, I don't know if you saw Greg Carey's commentary of your book, and he asked why that term didn't come up more, and I'm wondering whether you think that was something that Jesus was, somebody who advocated nonviolent resistance, if that's a term you would apply.
That's a completely modern idea. I mean, I know that we want Jesus to be Gandhi, but Jesus wasn't Gandhi, because the idea of non-violent resistance to a brutal, bloody military occupation of the Holy Land was something that just simply did not exist as a widespread phenomenon in Jesus' time. Every resistor to Rome that we know of resisted in a revolutionary way. There were groups like, for instance, the Essenes, who resisted Rome in what could be understood as a non-violent way, but what they meant by that is that they divorced themselves completely from society. They were monks, essentially, and Jesus was not a monk. You have to understand that in first century Palestine, simply saying the words, "I am the Messiah," is a treasonable offense. The Messiah means the anointed one. The job of the Messiah, as the descendant of King David, is to recreate King David's kingdom on earth, to usher in the rule of God. That means that you are ushering out the rule of Caesar. And I know that we would like to think that Jesus was a guy who thought that he could get rid of the Roman Empire by conducting some kind of sit-in in the temple. But that's our interpretation. That's our modern mindset being implanted on a 2,000-year-old story.
See, Reza, I'm watching your body language, I'm listening to you speak, and you have done so many interviews on this book, but I'm feeling and I'm hearing the passion. And one of the things that people are really intrigued by is that you are a Muslim and you are so obsessed by Jesus of Nazareth. Can you explain that?
Why wouldn't I be obsessed with Jesus of Nazareth? You're talking about an illiterate, uneducated, poor, marginal Jewish peasant from the backwoods of Galilee who came from a village, Nazareth, that was so small, so inconsequential, that its name does not appear on any document or map before the end of the 1st century, who, despite his lack of education, his lack of wealth and power, started a movement on behalf of the marginalized, the dispossessed, the outcast, the poor, the weak, and a movement, by the way, that was so threatening to the religious and political powers of his day that he was executed for it. That sounds like the most interesting man in the world. Why isn't everybody obsessed with this guy?
There should be a meme for that. Well, you know, there's someone in our Google Plus Hangout who has almost similar personal story. Maggie, explain to us why I mentioned that, and then go ahead with your question.
Well, I think what you're referring to is that I myself used to be Christian and later converted to Islam. And my question for you is actually also on a more personal level. I too am obsessed with Jesus as someone who's beginning graduate studies this fall. And so I was wondering how it is as you're conducting this research, how do you reconcile these kinds of struggles that you find, these differences that you find between what you might believe or the general beliefs of your religion and what you determine to be historically accurate?
That's a very, very good question. And it's a question that all scholars of religion who also happen to be people of faith are constantly struggling with. The fact of the matter is that when you study the world's religions like I do, it's hard to not notice that these religions are all basically saying the same thing, but using a different language of symbols and metaphors to say it. The response of some scholars of religion is that, well, then the whole thing is bunk and forget about it. The response of some scholars, however, is that, well, maybe the reason that we're all saying the same thing is that we're all talking about the exact same God, and that's how I feel. I'm a Muslim not because I think Islam is right or correct, whereas Christianity and Judaism is incorrect and wrong. Islam isn't more true than other religions as far as I'm concerned. I just prefer the way that Islam describes God, talks about God, the symbols and metaphors that Islam uses to express this inexpressible feeling of faith, the relationship between creator and creation, between humanity and God, are symbols and metaphors that make sense to me, much more so than the symbols and metaphors of Hinduism or Buddhism or Christianity or Judaism do. But that's it. That's the only difference as far as I'm concerned between them. The answer to your question, however, might be a little bit more shocking to a number of Jews and Christians and Muslims alike, which is that I don't believe in Islam. I don't believe in any religion. I actually don't understand people who say that they believe in Christianity, they believe in Judaism. Christianity is not something to believe in. It is the path to God. It is a signpost to something to believe in. It's not an end in and of itself. It's the means to an end.
Right.
Anyone who tells you that they believe in Islam has completely missed the point of Islam. Islam is the means to help you believe in God and to express that belief. So my belief, my faith isn't in Islam. My faith is in God. I like the way Islam expresses that faith in God, and so I choose to use Islam as my spirituality.
So Reza, you've got our Muslim viewers stirred up, you've got our Christian viewers stirred up, you've got our atheist viewers stirred up. Perfect timing for us to go into the post show at stream.aljazeera.com.
I must be doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick fire tweet session because we've had so many tweets coming into the show with questions for you. Do you have the stamina for tweet after tweet after tweet, Reza?
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay, I think he has. Stream.aljazeera.com. That's where we're going to be going with Reza Aslan in just a moment. But let me tell you about Wednesday. Today is Wednesday. Let me tell you about Thursday's program. What should be done to end the sexual abuse of children in Morocco? After the royal pardoning scandal of a convicted paedophile, thousands in Morocco continue to rally for greater protection of children. We'll be discussing that on tomorrow's AJ stream. But right now, you know where we'll be online. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Streams Online Post Show. Still with us is the author Reza Aslan. His latest book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, has stirred up a lot of controversy. And in our Google Plus Hangout, Ashley Miller, a writer and member of the atheist movement, Amar Hussain, he's a Muslim interfaith activist, Danielle Tumino, she's an Episcopal priest, Maggie Siddiqui, she's a student studying Islam and interfaith relations, and everybody who tweeted into us as well. We're going to have a quick fire tweet session. Reza, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so we've got Sean Fu here. He's on my computer. He tweeted into us. Now he says, Reza mentioned his wife, his mum and brother-in-law are Christians. I truly admire this embodiment of acceptance. How do they work it out?
My wife Jessica and I believe exactly the same thing. We share the exact same values. It's just that we use two different sets of languages to express those values. Now, fortunately, I'm familiar with her language, Christianity. Once I familiarized her with my language, Islam, there was never any problem. Now we are both familiar with our languages. It's like being in a relationship, you know, between a French person and a German person.
Never going to
learn
work.
each other's language.
No. Moving on.
Well, continuing rather, a rapid fire question. Danielle in the Hangout, go ahead.
Hi, Reza. I was wondering what you hope the faithful Christian reader will take from your book.
I think that Christians believe that Jesus is fully God and fully man. It's just that when they go to church, they usually only hear about the fully God part. Rarely do you actually hear about the man and the world in which he lived. So I think Christians would want to know about who this person that they believe is God actually was and what he actually said the world in which he lived, which is why I've received hundreds of emails from Christians telling me that this book has actually enriched their faith.
Reza, I know you're no stranger to Twitter critiques. I'm going to send one your way. Are you ready for this?
Yes.
This is Robert Raves. He says, ask why he lies about his credentials. He teaches creative writing, not religion.
I have had 3 full-time professorships in the Department of Religion, one at the University of Iowa, one at the Drew University, and currently at the University of California at Riverside, where I am both Associate Professor of Creative Writing and Cooperative Faculty at Riverside. This credentials thing is so funny because it's been answered both by the universities that have educated me and by the universities that actually have employed me. And the only reason I can think of that it still is brought up by the right is because they refuse to actually talk about the book itself, and instead they want to talk about me. And maybe it's just hard for people to understand that you can actually be an expert in more than one discipline, but it turns out that you can be.
Well, the question specifically on some of that reaction you've been getting from Ali Latifi on Twitter, he wants to know, you said your book is different from the Islamic story of Jesus. How have Muslims reacted to the book?
Well, again, I think it's run the gambit like the Christian response. A lot of Muslims are deeply offended by the fact that it seems to overturn some of the Quranic views about Jesus. Many Muslims have no problem reconciling their faith with the story that I provide in the book. And some Muslims don't have a problem with it at all. You know, people of different faiths, people of faith tend to have different reactions to these kinds of things.
So, one of the questions that I wanted to ask, and I didn't get into the main show, was about miracles. So the Zealot, it tells you that Mary possibly could have been a single mum. The crucifixion is not quite how it is portrayed in the New Testament, and that the resurrection, there's some evidence that it perhaps didn't happen. And then you say miracles, though, lots of evidence for that. That
crazy.
was weird. Explain.
Yeah, it's crazy. I know. It's weird for a historian to say that that sort of the one thing we know about Jesus's ministry is that he was a miracle worker. That's how he was understood by his friends and enemies alike. He was a miracle worker. And we have an enormous amount of evidence that he was known as a miracle worker. We don't have evidence about his actual miracles. We just have evidence that he was known as a miracle worker. But again, let's put that in context. There were hundreds of miracle workers in Jesus' time, and I mentioned some of the most famous ones. This is a time in which magic and miracle were a part of the daily understanding of the Jews, and Romans for that matter. It's a world that's steeped in magic and miracle. So yes, it's true that as a historian, I can say that we can be fairly confident that Jesus was known as a miracle worker, and that may blow people's minds who aren't people of faith, but also understand that there were many, many miracle workers in Jesus' time.
Steeped in magic and miracle, you've made a book about Jesus sound better than Harry Potter, which is a tough feat. But I want to go to a Google Plus Hangout. Almir, go ahead.
Based on what you said in the interview about religion being an interpretation, that all interpretations are valid, what do you think of people who take religion to extremes, like we've seen in the media, like fundamentalists? Do you think those are as valid as people who don't subscribe to those things?
Yes, but remember, valid is not a judgment about, you know, whether it's good or bad. Valid just means that the problem with Scripture is that you can make it mean whatever you want it to mean. I mean, I know a lot of people say things like, well, bin Laden's not really a Muslim. Yeah, well, I wish that were true, but unfortunately it's not. He is a Muslim just like I'm a Muslim, just like anybody else who says he's a Muslim is a Muslim. But his interpretation is unreasonable. I personally think it's un-Quranic. But is it any less valid? No, it's not any less valid. I mean, that's the thing about interpretation is, again, by definition, the definition of the word itself means that it's how you see the Scriptures. And how you see the Scriptures depends almost entirely on who you are, not what the Scripture says.
There's something that's confusing me about the book, just the style of it. The style is like a fantastic novel, easy to read, but the content is pretty challenging. So I'm reading it going, do I have time to check up all of these references in the notes at the back? No, I do not. But there's a scholarly part of the book, and then there's a great way of writing at the same time. So I couldn't work out, who are you aiming it at?
Well, I did that for No God But God, too. I
Right.
mean, I'm aiming for a general audience, the kind of audience that would normally not, you know, read the kinds of scholarly tomes that I spend my days reading. And I want them to be able to read it like it's a novel. I mean, I'm a storyteller. I was trained as a storyteller. I want to tell stories, stories that help people understand very complex, heady things. But as a scholar, I also am pretty confident in my own interpretation and the work that I've done to come up with it. And so, for instance, with Zealot, I have almost 100 pages of narrative form notes that if you're the kind of person who wants to know about the debate, who agrees with me, who disagrees with me, how did I come up with this particular interpretation, it's all there in the back of the book.
Well, let's get another question from Ashley Miller. A good one. Go ahead, Ashley.
So my question is, your view of first century Palestine is sort of chock full of magicians and miracle workers. Why do you think it is that Jesus lasted? Jesus became a figure.
Right. That's ultimately the sort of the million-dollar question that I try to answer in the book. And the short answer is that it had less to do with anything Jesus himself said or did, though what he said or did was absolutely remarkable, as I talk about, than it did with what his followers said, or followers said he did and said. To put it in its, again, the simplest terms, according to everything ever written about the Messiah in Judaism, a dead Messiah is no longer the Messiah. It's as simple as that. And all the other people in Jesus' time who claimed to be the Messiah and who were killed for that claim, their messianic movements collapsed. Their followers went back home. But Jesus' followers did not. They stuck around instead because they said that they were spurred by this mystical experience that they had of the risen Christ, that it actually changed everything for them. And it compelled them to reshape, reinterpret what Messiah actually means, to reinterpret Jesus' life in order to make sense of the fact that insofar as his messianic functions were concerned, he failed to actually do anything that the Messiah is supposed to do. So either Jesus is not the Messiah, or what we thought the Messiah was supposed to do is wrong. And they chose the latter. And they began to reinterpret Jesus' life, the meaning of Messiah, and then most importantly, they began to preach that new message about Jesus, not just to their fellow Jews, but to the Romans. And it was when the Romans began to adopt this message of Jesus as a God-man, Jesus not as a Jewish revolutionary, but as a celestial spirit, Jesus not as someone who wanted to create the kingdom of God on earth, but someone whose kingdom was on another plane, a kingdom that was not of this earth at all. That Jesus was enormously appealing to the Romans, who ultimately adopted it as the imperial religion of the state, and Christianity as we know it today was born.
Right. So I'm reading the book and it's freaking me out at various intervals because I am a Christian, and I'm being completely freaked out until I get to the end of the book, and I'm just going to read you the end. It's not really a spoiler, but it's kind of beautiful. This is what Reza says, the very last part of the book. The one thing that any comprehensive study of the historical Jesus should hopefully reveal is that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the man, is every bit as compelling, charismatic and praiseworthy as Jesus the Christ. He is, in short, someone worth believing in. I was like, oh, thank goodness for that when I got to the end. Reza, why did you write the end of the book in that way?
Because I believe in him, because I actually follow Jesus the man. I've shaped my life, my values, the way that I confront the world by the example that he provided. I mean, this is a man who, again, in the name of the outcasts, sacrificed his life by challenging the powers of his time. You know, the social teachings of Jesus, his attempt to reverse the social order, to say that in his world, the poor will become rich and the rich will become poor, the weak will become powerful and the powerful will become powerless. This is the kind of man that I want to know. I knew Jesus as Christ. I used to be a Christian.
Right.
I worshipped him as God. But when I stopped being a Christian and instead looked at him as a historian, that Jesus became more real to me. That's a Jesus that I wanted to have a relationship with.
Okay. I would love to continue our relationship between the stream and Reza Aslan, but the satellite window is about to wind up. So I want to say thank you to Reza. Thank you so much for being part of the program. 45 minutes on his book, and I know he's still got more to say. Reza, it's been such a great pleasure. Thank you to Amma, Danielle, Maggie, Ashley, and to everybody who sent in their tweets to us. So, tomorrow's program. What should be done to end the sexual abuse of children in Morocco? After the royal pardoning scandal of a convicted paedophile, thousands in Morocco continue to rally for greater protection of children. We will take up that issue on the stream tomorrow. Until then, you know where we will be at stream.aljazeera.com. See you online. Thanks for watching.